I'm proud of all my children. Except the failure sitting at this table, everyone laughed. I stood up, placed a secret document on the table, and said, when he finally opened it. The Thanksgiving table gleamed under the chandelier my father had installed last spring. Crystal glasses caught the light, casting prisms across the white tablecloth my mother had ironed to perfection. The turkey sat in the center, golden brown and glistening, surrounded by dishes that had taken my mother days to prepare. Outside, snow fell silently on my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate, a picture-perfect holiday scene. I'd been dreading this dinner for weeks. Coming home always left me with a hollow feeling in my stomach that no amount of my mother's cooking could fill. At 32, I still felt like the awkward teenager who could never measure up to my siblings' accomplishments. My older sister Valerie, seated to my father's right, had just made partner at her law firm in Boston. My younger brother Matthew, across from me, had recently secured millions in funding for his tech startup. And then there was me, Eliza Wheeler, who'd just been laid off from my editorial position at Horizon Publishing, a small publishing house in New York, after 3 years working there. I hadn't told them yet about losing my job. I'd spent the drive from the city rehearsing explanations, excuses, anything that might soften the blow of yet another disappointment I'd be delivering to my family. But looking at my father's stern profile as he carved the turkey, I knew nothing would shield me from his judgment. Mom passed around the cranberry sauce, her hands adorned with the diamond tennis bracelet Dad had given her for their anniversary. So, Eliza, she said with forced cheerfulness, how are things at Horizon Publishing? The table fell silent, all eyes turning to me. I took a large sip of wine, buying time. Actually, I began, but my father cut me off. Probably another restructuring, he said, making air quotes. These small presses are always one bad quarter away from folding. I told you to take that offer from Pearson 5 years ago, didn't I? I stared down at my plate. The company is fine. They're just what? Not appreciating your contributions? He snorted, passing plates of turkey around the table. Perhaps if you'd finished your MBA instead of that impractical creative writing degree. My mother shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. This was familiar territory. My father, Richard Wheeler, had built Wheeler Financial from nothing, turning it into one of the most successful investment firms in New England. His expectations for his children were as towering as the mansion he'd constructed to house us. Valerie stepped in, always the peacemaker. Dad, come on. Not everyone needs to follow your exact path to be successful. She smiled at me sympathetically, and I felt a stab of gratitude mixed with resentment. I didn't need her pity. Matthew chimed in, yeah, Liz is doing what she loves. That counts for something. Does it? My father raised his eyebrows. When that something doesn't pay the bills. When it means living in that shoebox apartment with roommates at her age. He shook his head, serving himself potatoes. Both of you were homeowners by 30. Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, tried changing the subject. Diana, this turkey is absolutely divine. You've outdone yourself. But my father wasn't finished. He raised his glass, commanding the attention of everyone at the table, my siblings, my aunt and uncle, my cousins, and my grandmother. I'd like to propose a toast, he announced. To my children, who make me proud every day. His gaze swept past me to rest on Valerie and Matthew. Valerie, who's following in my footsteps at the firm, and Matthew, who's shown incredible entrepreneurial spirit. He paused, and I knew what was coming next. I gripped my napkin under the table, knuckles whitening. I'm proud of all my children. His eyes finally landed on me, cold and assessing, except the failure sitting at this table. The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter, the kind that comes from not knowing how else to respond to cruelty disguised as humor. My mother looked mortified. My siblings exchanged glances. My cousin Jake actually snorted into his wine glass. As the laughter echoed around me, I was transported back to my high school graduation. I'd been valedictorian, an achievement that had required countless late nights studying while Valerie and Matthew attended parties and football games. When I told my father, his response had been a distracted "that's nice, sweetheart" as he continued reviewing Matthew's college applications. At the ceremony, he'd spent most of my speech-checking emails on his BlackBerry. Later that evening, at my graduation dinner, Grandma Ruth had given me a fountain pen that had belonged to my grandfather. He would have been so proud, she'd whispered. My father had overheard and remarked, let's not set unrealistic expectations. The academic stuff has always come easy to her. Real life will be different. I tucked the pen away in my jewelry box where it remained, untouched. Then there was my college graduation from Columbia. I'd earned a prestigious writing fellowship that only 2 students received each year. My parents and siblings had attended, but my father had insisted on leaving immediately after the ceremony, missing the special reception for fellowship recipients. Wall Street doesn't pause for poetry readings, Eliza, he'd said when I expressed my disappointment. That night, he'd taken us all to an expensive restaurant where he'd spent the evening discussing Valerie's law school applications and Matthew's internship at a venture capital firm. The memories continued to cascade, my first published short story, which he hadn't read, my promotion to assistant editor, which he dismissed as playing with other people's words, the small literary award I'd won last year, which he called one of those participation trophies they give out these days. Each dismissal, each cutting remark, each comparison to my siblings had been a paper cut on my soul. Individually, they seemed minor, easily dismissed with a forced smile and a change of subject. But collectively, over years, they had left scars that never fully healed. And now, watching my extended family laugh at his latest cruelty, something inside me snapped. 20 years of these jokes at family gatherings. 20 years of never being enough. 20 years of trying to earn the approval of a man who had decided long ago that I wasn't worth his pride. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The laughter died immediately. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, expecting the usual response, for me to excuse myself, perhaps cry in the bathroom, then return with a forced smile and take the abuse. Not today. I reached into my purse hanging on the back of my chair and pulled out a manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, debating whether I'd ever have the courage to use it. You know, Dad, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I've spent my entire life trying to make you proud. I got straight A's in high school, graduated summa cum laude from Columbia, won awards for my writing. I placed the envelope on the table beside his plate. But nothing was ever good enough because it wasn't what you wanted. My father's expression darkened. Eliza, sit down. You're making a scene. No, I don't think I will, I replied. You've had the floor for decades. It's my turn now. The table was deathly silent. My mother looked terrified, Valerie shocked, and Matthew. Was that a hint of admiration in his eyes? What is this? My father gestured dismissively at the envelope. Open it, I said, remaining standing. Or are you afraid to? His jaw tightened, the same expression he wore when someone challenged him in business. He snatched up the envelope and tore it open, pulling out the contents, about 20 pages of documents, emails, and financial statements. I watched his face as he scanned the first page. Confusion, then disbelief, then something I'd rarely seen on my father's face, fear. Where did you get this? He whispered. I'm a failure, aren't I? I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A failure who spent the last 3 years investigating Wheeler Financial while working on what was supposed to be a puff piece about successful family businesses for the publishing house. I turned to address the table. Did you know that Dad has been systematically defrauding his clients for over a decade? That he's been running a modified Ponzi scheme, using new investor funds to cover losses and inflate returns for existing clients? It had started 3 years ago. My editor at Horizon Publishing had assigned me a profile on generational wealth advisors, families who pass down financial expertise through the generations. Wheeler Financial was an obvious candidate, and despite my reservations about featuring my own family, my editor had insisted it would be the centerpiece of the series. During my initial research, I'd noticed discrepancies in the company's public filings. Small inconsistencies that might have seemed like clerical errors to most people, but my years of fact-checking and editorial work had trained me to spot patterns in data. The reported returns seemed too consistent, too perfect, defying market volatility that affected every other similar firm. I'd mentioned my concerns to Jacob, my roommate who worked as a financial analyst. Probably nothing, I'd said over takeout in our cramped kitchen. Dad's always been meticulous. Jacob had pulled up some industry benchmarks on his laptop. These returns are unusual, he'd said carefully. Not impossible, but statistically improbable over this time period. Especially given the market crashes. That conversation had sparked a quiet investigation that consumed my nights and weekends for months. I'd cultivated sources at the SEC, befriended administrative staff at Wheeler Financial, even reconnected with former employees who'd left under mysterious circumstances. Each piece of evidence I uncovered made me physically ill, but I couldn't stop. It was like pulling at a loose thread and watching an entire sweater unravel. The turning point had come a year and a half ago. I'd met with Diane Reynolds, my father's former executive assistant who'd been abruptly fired 5 years earlier. We met at a coffee shop in New Jersey, far from anyone who might recognize us. Your father keeps 2 sets of books, she told me, sliding a flash drive across the table. I made copies before he fired me. I knew someday someone would need them. Why didn't you go to the authorities? I'd asked. Her eyes had hardened. I tried. But your father has friends everywhere, the local police, the state regulators. One detective actually called him while I was still in the station filing my report. She'd wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. 2 days later, my brother-in-law lost his job. My nephew's college scholarship was mysteriously rescinded. The message was clear. I'd taken the flash drive home and spent all night reviewing the files. They showed systematic fraud, client funds being diverted to offshore accounts, fabricated statements, manipulated returns. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of clients. Millions of dollars. Among the victims were charities, retirement funds, even the children's hospital where my mother served on the board. I'd thrown up twice that night, then called an old college friend who now worked for the FBI's white-collar crime division. What followed was a carefully orchestrated investigation. I became an unofficial informant, continuing my work at the publishing house while feeding information to federal investigators. During company parties and events where my father was present, I wore wires. On holiday visits to my parents' home, I'd sneak into his study to copy documents. I recorded phone calls with my father, carefully steering conversations toward his business practices. All while smiling through his constant belittling, his jokes at my expense, his dismissal of my career and life choices. The pressure had been enormous. I lost 15 pounds. Developed insomnia. Started seeing a therapist twice weekly. Jacob and my small circle of trusted friends watched me deteriorate with growing concern. Is it worth it? My therapist had asked during one particularly difficult session. Pursuing this investigation at such cost to yourself? I considered the question carefully. If it were just about me, about his treatment of me, maybe not. But there are real victims. People who trusted him with their life savings, their children's college funds, their retirement. What kind of person would I be if I knew and did nothing? Over the past 6 months, the FBI and SEC had intensified their investigation, gathering enough evidence to build a solid case. My involvement became more crucial as they prepared for potential prosecution. The final piece had fallen into place 3 weeks ago. An email chain my father had carelessly left open on his computer during a Sunday dinner, revealing communications with a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I'd photographed the entire exchange with my phone while he'd stepped out to take a call. The FBI had confirmed it was the smoking gun they needed. 2 weeks ago, Horizon Publishing had downsized, and my position had been eliminated. The timing couldn't have been worse, but in a way, it was also perfect. The investigation was complete. The authorities were ready to move. And now I was free to deliver the final blow. And so, here I stood, watching the color drain from my father's face as his crimes were exposed to our extended family. Gasps echoed around the room. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Valerie, the lawyer, reached for the papers, but my father clutched them to his chest. That's ridiculous, he sputtered. This is fabricated. Eliza has always had an overactive imagination. Is it fabricated, Dad? Because the SEC doesn't think so. Neither does the FBI. They've been building a case against you for months. I've been helping them. The color drained from his face. You see, I continued, surprisingly calm, while you were busy dismissing my career choices, I was using my impractical journalism skills to uncover what might be the biggest financial fraud in Connecticut history. I turned to Valerie. Those mysterious client accounts you weren't allowed to touch? The ones Dad kept separate from the rest of the firm? Take a look at where that money really went. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, all of it. Valerie stared at our father, her legal mind clearly racing to process the implications. This is preposterous, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eliza is clearly making this up for attention. My grandmother, who had been silently watching the exchange, spoke up. Richard, let me see those papers. Grandma Ruth had been my grandfather's bookkeeper before he passed away. Though in her 80s now, her mind was sharp as ever. Dad reluctantly slid the documents toward her. I continued while she reviewed them. I didn't want to believe it at first. I spent months verifying every detail, hoping I was wrong. But the evidence kept mounting. Matthew stood up now, moving beside me in a show of support. Is this true, Dad? My father's eyes darted around the table, seeking allies but finding none. This is a family matter that should be discussed in private, he hissed. Like how you publicly humiliate me at every family gathering? I countered. No, I think this is exactly the right venue. Grandma Ruth looked up from the papers, her face ashen. Richard, what have you done? That seemed to break something in him. My father, always so confident and commanding, suddenly looked small. You don't understand the pressure, he began. After the market crash in 2008, we took heavy losses. Clients were panicking, threatening to pull their investments. I just needed time to recover. So you started using new client funds to pay existing clients, Valerie finished, the legal ramifications clearly dawning on her. And when that wasn't enough, you started stealing. I was protecting our family name, he shouted, slamming his fist on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. Everything I've done has been for this family. No, I said quietly. It was for your ego? Your reputation. Your pride. My mother, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood. All those charities, she whispered. Our friends' retirement funds. The hospital endowment. She looked at my father with growing horror. Richard, tell me this isn't true. But he couldn't. The FBI will be making arrests tomorrow morning, I said. I'm only telling you now so you can prepare. My father lunged across the table, grabbing my wrist. You ungrateful little. Matthew immediately stepped forward, breaking his grip on me. Don't, he warned. My father's face contorted with rage. I'd seen glimpses of this temper throughout my childhood, usually directed at service workers or business competitors, rarely at us. His carefully maintained public persona, Respected businessman, philanthropist, family man, cracked completely, revealing the ruthless operator beneath. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "No idea of the consequences." "I know exactly what I've done," I replied, refusing to back down. "I've exposed the truth." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "The truth? You think this is about truth? This is about jealousy. You've always resented your siblings' success. Always played the victim. Poor little Eliza, never daddy's favorite." The accusation stung, but I held my ground. "This isn't about favorites, Dad. It's about fraud. It's about the people you've hurt." "People get hurt in business every day," he snapped. "That's how the world works. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Hiding in your little publishing house, playing with stories instead of building something real." Grandma Ruth spoke up, her voice quivering with anger. "Richard Wheeler, I did not raise my son to be a thief." He turned on her. "Stay out of this, Mother. You've always coddled her, filled her head with nonsense about her special gifts." "Don't speak to Grandma that way," Valerie said sharply, rising to her feet. The papers were spread before her now, and the horror in her eyes told me she understood exactly what she was seeing. My mother had begun to cry silently, shoulders shaking as the full impact of the situation hit her. Uncle David moved to comfort her, putting an arm around her shoulders. My father's eyes darted around the table, calculating, as he always did in moments of crisis. I could almost see him running through scenarios, looking for an escape route, a way to spin this, to regain control. "You're all overreacting," he said, his tone suddenly reasonable, conciliatory. "These documents are being presented without context. Eliza has always had a flair for the dramatic. If you'll all just calm down, I can explain everything." It was a familiar tactic, gaslighting, minimizing, making me seem hysterical or unreliable. It had worked countless times before, convincing everyone, sometimes even me, that I was overreacting or misinterpreting situations. "There's no explaining this away, Dad," Matthew said quietly. He had moved to look over Valerie's shoulder at the documents. "These are fraudulent statements. Falsified returns. Diverted funds." He looked up, meeting our father's gaze. "How could you do this?" "You don't understand the pressures of running a business like mine," my father replied, his voice taking on a wounded tone. "The expectations, the responsibility. I've carried this family on my back for decades." "By stealing from others?" I asked. "By doing what was necessary," he snapped, the reasonable facade crumbling again. "Who paid for your fancy Columbia education? Who subsidized your apartment when your entry-level publishing salary couldn't cover rent in New York? Who bailed you out every time your impractical choices led to financial disaster?" Each question landed like a slap, because there was truth in them. He had paid for my education. He had helped with rent during my early years in publishing. He had provided a safety net that allowed me to pursue a career in a notoriously underpaid industry. But that didn't justify what he'd done. "You're right," I acknowledged. "I've benefited from your financial support. We all have. But that money wasn't just yours to give. It belonged to your clients, to the people who trusted you." "This is business," he insisted. "You're making it personal." "It is personal," Valerie interjected, looking up from the papers. "Mrs. Abernathy's retirement fund? The Wilsons' college savings for their twins? The endowment for Grandpa's scholarship at Dartmouth? These are people we know, Dad. People who trusted you." Her voice broke slightly. "People I've looked in the eye and assured that their investments were safe with Wheeler Financial." My father's expression darkened. "You're a lawyer, Valerie. You should understand better than anyone that perception is reality in finance. As long as clients believed their money was safe and growing, it was. The system worked. Until it didn't," I said. "Until you couldn't find enough new investors to cover your obligations to the existing ones. That's how Ponzi schemes always end, Dad." He flinched at the term. "This is not a Ponzi scheme. It's a temporary liquidity issue that you've now made impossible to resolve." Matthew shook his head in disbelief. "Dad, these documents show the temporary liquidity issue has been going on for over 10 years. My father glanced toward the door to his study. I knew what he was thinking: his computer, his files, evidence he needed to destroy. His eyes narrowed as he seemed to make a decision. Without warning, he shoved his chair back and bolted toward his study. Valerie, instantly understanding his intentions, called out, "Stop him. He's going to destroy evidence." Matthew and Uncle David immediately sprang into action, racing after him down the hallway. We heard the sound of a scuffle, something heavy falling, then breaking glass. The rest of us sat frozen at the table, the tension unbearable as we waited. Minutes later, Matthew and my uncle returned, escorting my father between them. He had a small cut on his forehead that was bleeding slightly, and murder in his eyes as he glared at me. "She's lying," he kept saying. "My own daughter, trying to destroy me." Aunt Carol was on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed tones. My cousins sat frozen in shock. My mother had collapsed back into her chair, staring blankly at the feast before her. Grandma Ruth took my hand. "You did the right thing, Eliza. Your grandfather would be proud." Those words, "would be proud," hit me harder than I expected. Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I didn't do it for pride," I said. "I did it because it was right." The next hours passed in a blur. The FBI arrived earlier than planned after Valerie called them, concerned that my father might flee or destroy more evidence. They arrested him in the dining room, reading him his rights as the turkey grew cold on the table. Agents interviewed family members one by one. My mother alternated between sobbing and sitting in shocked silence. Valerie went into full lawyer mode, already strategizing how to protect the legitimate aspects of the family business. Matthew put his arm around me and whispered, "You're the bravest of all of us, Liz. I'm sorry I never saw it before." As the evening wore on, most of the extended family left. The FBI finally cleared out around midnight, taking my father with them. I found myself alone in the kitchen with my mother, who was mechanically wrapping leftovers no one had touched. "Mom," I said gently. "I'm so sorry it happened this way." She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed but surprisingly clear. "Did you know," she said, "that your father proposed to me by showing me the blueprint for this house? He said, 'This is what I'll build for you.' I was 22 and thought it was the most romantic thing in the world." She sealed a container of mashed potatoes with more force than necessary. I never questioned where the money came from. I never asked why we kept getting more when everyone else lost so much in the recession. I just accepted the life he built. She laughed bitterly. "What does that make me?" "A victim," I said firmly. "Like everyone else he deceived." She shook her head. "No. At some level, I knew. I chose not to see." She looked at me directly for what felt like the first time in years. "But you saw. You always saw things clearly. That's why he resented you so much." The revelation struck me. My father hadn't hated me for being a failure, he feared me for seeing through him. "Why did you never defend me?" I asked, the question I'd wanted to ask for decades finally finding voice. She looked down at her hands. "Because I was afraid of him too." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of that admission hanging between us. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "The legal process will take time," I said. "There will be trials, settlements. The firm will probably be dissolved, assets seized. But the investigators promised me they'll try to recover as much money for the victims as possible." She nodded absently, then looked up. "No, I mean with us. With you." I hadn't thought that far ahead. For 3 years, my focus had been on gathering evidence, on building the case. I hadn't allowed myself to consider what would come after. "I don't know," I admitted. My job at Horizon was real, but I was let go last month when they downsized. The book I was working on about financial crimes is almost finished, though. My agent thinks it will sell well, given everything. My mother reached across the island and took my hand. "Stay here tonight. We have a lot to figure out, but not everything needs to be decided now." I nodded, suddenly exhausted. As I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom later, I passed the family photos lining the wall, carefully curated images of the perfect Wheeler family. My father standing proudly behind Valerie at her law school graduation. My father with his arm around Matthew at the launch of his first startup. And me, fewer photos, always slightly separated from the group, my father rarely touching me. In my childhood bedroom, nothing had changed. Trophies from debate competitions lined the bookshelf. Framed certificates and honor roll mentions hung on the walls. Physical proof of my desperate attempts to earn my father's approval. I sat on the edge of my bed and finally allowed myself to cry, not from sadness, but from relief. The weight I'd carried for years, the secret investigation, the fear of this very confrontation, it was over. My phone buzzed with a text from Jacob, my roommate in New York. "Everything okay? Did you do it?" I texted back, "Yes. It's done. Dad arrested. Family in shambles. Strangely, I'm fine." His response came quickly, "You're the strongest person I know. We're all here when you get back. We're all here, my real family, the one I'd built for myself in New York. Friends who valued me for who I was, not what I achieved or how I reflected on them." I fell asleep in my childhood bed for what I suspected would be the last time. The morning brought reporters camped outside the gates of the estate. The story had broken overnight. Financial mogul Richard Wheeler arrested for massive fraud scheme uncovered by daughter. Valerie handled them masterfully, giving a brief statement about the family's shock and their commitment to cooperating with authorities to make things right for the victims. Matthew worked on securing the company's servers and files to prevent any remaining evidence from disappearing. I stayed inside with my mother, helping her process what had happened. By afternoon, we were sitting in the sunroom, drinking tea and talking more honestly than we ever had. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I've always been proud of you. I didn't know how to show it without angering your father." "I know, Mom." "No, you don't," she insisted. "When you published that short story collection 2 years ago, I bought 10 copies. I keep one on my nightstand. I've read it 3 times. I stared at her, speechless. Richard wouldn't allow me to display it in the house, she continued. He said it would only encourage you to continue wasting your potential. The revelation stung, but also healed something in me. You read my book? Of course I did. You've always had a gift with words. She hesitated. The character in the third story, the mother who collects porcelain birds but never flies herself, was that me? I nodded, unable to speak. It was. Accurate, she said with a sad smile. Too accurate. She set down her teacup decisively. But I'm not that woman anymore. I can't be, now. 3 days later, I returned to New York. The story had exploded nationally, with financial news networks dissecting my father's fraud scheme and human interest pieces focusing on the whistleblower daughter angle. My publisher, who had laid me off the previous month, called with a job offer, a substantial promotion, in fact. I declined. The advance for my book on financial crimes would sustain me while I finished it. Weeks passed. My father remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk. Valerie took control of the remaining legitimate assets of Wheeler Financial, working with authorities to determine what could be salvaged. Matthew threw himself into his own company, distancing himself from our father's legacy. My mother filed for divorce and began volunteer work with a financial literacy program for women leaving abusive relationships. I finished my book, titled The Family Business: How I Uncovered My Father's Financial Empire of Lies. It was cathartic to put everything on paper, to transform 3 years of investigation and a lifetime of emotional abuse into something that might help others recognize the warning signs of fraud and manipulation. The writing process had been both therapeutic and traumatic. Each chapter forced me to relive moments I tried to forget, not just the investigation, but all the years leading up to it. I wrote about my childhood growing up in my father's shadow, about the subtle ways he'd pitted us siblings against each other, about the impossible standards he'd set and the criticism that followed when we inevitably fell short. My editor, Sophia Martinez, had been relentless in pushing me to dig deeper. The financial crime is the hook, she'd said during one particularly difficult revision session, but the family dynamics are the heart. That's what readers will connect with. She was right, of course. The sections about complex financial fraud were necessary but technical. The emotional core of the book, the story of a daughter finding her voice and standing up to an abusive parent, was universal. I'd interviewed dozens of people for the book, former clients of my father's, employees of Wheeler Financial, investigators from the SEC and FBI, even experts on financial psychology who helped me understand how intelligent, successful people like my father could justify increasingly unethical behavior to themselves. The hardest interviews had been with my own family. Valerie had initially been reluctant, still processing her own feelings of betrayal and complicity. She'd worked at the firm for 5 years, though my father had carefully kept her away from the fraudulent aspects of the business. I should have seen it, she'd said during our interview, her legal training making her precise even in her guilt. There were signs, clients I wasn't allowed to meet, accounts I couldn't access, meetings I was excluded from. I told myself it was because Dad didn't think I was ready, that he was protecting me while I learned the business. I never considered he might be protecting himself from me. Matthew's interview had been equally revealing. As the golden child, the son who was supposed to eventually take over the family business, he'd been given more access than Valerie but had been too focused on his own startups to pay close attention. Dad always talked about legacy, he told me. About building something that would last generations. I thought he meant building it honestly. Now I wonder if he ever believed in anything beyond appearances. My mother had been the most difficult interview subject. She'd agreed reluctantly, then spent the first 30 minutes answering my questions with the same polished responses she'd given at charity galas and country club luncheons for decades. This isn't helping either of us, I'd finally said, stopping the recording. Mom, I need you to be honest, not just for the book but for yourself. For us? She'd stared out the window of her new apartment, much smaller than the family mansion she'd vacated, for a long moment before nodding. Start the recorder, she'd said. What followed was 3 hours of raw, painful truth about her marriage, about the red flags she'd ignored, about her own complicity in maintaining the facade of perfect family life while enabling my father's worst behaviors. I thought I was protecting you children by staying, she'd said. Now I wonder if I was just protecting myself from having to start over. The final chapter had been the hardest to write. My editor had pushed me to end on a note of closure, of healing. But the reality was messier, more ambiguous. My father was awaiting trial. The victims were still fighting to recover their losses. My family was still piecing together our new reality. Readers need hope, Sophia had argued. They need truth, I'd countered. And the truth is that healing from this kind of betrayal isn't linear or neat. It's ongoing. Maybe lifelong. We'd compromised. The final chapter acknowledged the continuing journey while focusing on the small victories, the moments of genuine connection my family had found in the aftermath of disaster, the strength I discovered in myself when I finally stopped seeking my father's approval. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving, I received a letter from prison. My father's handwriting, once so commanding on birthday cards containing checks rather than personal messages, now seemed smaller, cramped. I considered throwing it away unopened but decided that whatever he had to say, I was strong enough to hear it. Eliza, he wrote. You've ruined me. Destroyed everything I built. Turned my family against me. I suppose you think you're very clever, very righteous. But let me ask you this, did exposing me make your life any better? Did it give you the career you wanted? The respect you craved? I doubt it. Some failures can't be fixed, not even with revenge. Dad. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. He still didn't understand. This had never been about revenge or career advancement. It had been about truth, about justice for the people he'd harmed. About finally standing up after a lifetime of being knocked down. And yes, my life was immeasurably better. Not because my father was in prison, but because I was finally free of trying to earn his approval. 1 year to the day after that Thanksgiving dinner, I received a call from my agent. The family business had been nominated for a prestigious journalism award. The ceremony would be in December. I invited my mother, Valerie, and Matthew to attend with me. To my surprise, they all agreed immediately. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were a whirlwind. My publisher arranged a book tour that took me to 12 cities in 14 days. I appeared on morning shows, podcasts, and news programs. People magazine ran a feature on me titled Truth Teller, How Eliza Wheeler Brought Down Her Father's Financial Empire. The attention was overwhelming. I'd spent most of my career behind the scenes, shaping other writers' words, rarely stepping into the spotlight myself. Now, I was being recognized everywhere, in coffee shops, at airports, on subway platforms. Aren't you that woman who turned in her father? A barista asked as she handed me my latte. Before I could respond, she added, my grandparents lost their retirement savings to a guy like your dad. What you did took guts. Not all the attention was positive. I received hate mail from people who believed family loyalty should trump all other considerations. A distant cousin wrote a scathing op-ed about me for the Wall Street Journal, calling me an opportunist who profited from my family's destruction. My father's golf buddies and business associates avoided me when we crossed paths in Manhattan, their eyes sliding past me as if I were invisible. Jacob helped me navigate the sudden fame, screening my emails, accompanying me to public appearances, reminding me to eat and sleep when the pressure became too intense. You know what's weird? I said to him one night as we shared takeout in our apartment. All this attention for doing what should have been the bare minimum, telling the truth. The bare minimum would have been looking the other way, he countered. Most people would have. Family loyalty is powerful. So is the truth, I said. The night before the award ceremony, I met Valerie and Matthew for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the village. We'd grown closer over the past year, our relationship strengthening once freed from our father's manipulative influence. Valerie had left corporate law to join a nonprofit focused on helping victims of financial fraud. Matthew had restructured his tech company to emphasize transparency and ethical business practices. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Valerie asked as we waited for our entrees. I considered the question. Not about the award. That feels secondary. But seeing all of us together, publicly, for the first time since everything happened, that's daunting. Matthew nodded. The Wheeler family, version 2.0. Dad-free edition. That's terrible, Valerie said, but she was smiling. How's Mom doing? I asked. Both of them saw her more regularly than I did, given their proximity to Connecticut. Better, Matthew said. The financial literacy program is giving her purpose. She's good at it, translating complex concepts into terms anyone can understand. All those years of watching Dad work, she absorbed more than she realized. And her therapist is helping her process everything, Valerie added. She's starting to recognize the patterns of emotional manipulation Dad used on all of us. It's like she's waking up from a decades-long fog. We talked late into the night, sharing memories both painful and precious, acknowledging the complex legacy we'd inherited. By the time we parted, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected, not because everything was resolved, but because we were facing it together. The night of the ceremony, as we sat together at a table near the front, I realized something profound. We'd become a real family in the wake of my father's downfall. Without his domineering presence, without the constant competition and judgment, we'd found our way back to each other. When my name was called as the winner, I approached the podium with steady steps. Looking out at the audience, I saw my family, not just my blood relatives, but also my New York friends, my agent, my editor, all people who had supported me through the darkest days. This book began as an investigation into financial crimes, I said into the microphone, but it became an exploration of the high cost of silence. Of the damage we do when we prioritize appearances over truth. Of the courage it takes to stand up and say enough. I took a deep breath, the weight of the award heavy in my hands but my heart lighter than it had been in years. I'm grateful to everyone who helped bring this story to light, especially those who were brave enough to come forward with their experiences. To the victims of financial fraud everywhere, I hope this book brings some measure of justice and healing. I paused, finding my mother's eyes in the audience. She was crying, but smiling through her tears. And to anyone who's ever been made to feel like a failure for not fitting someone else's definition of success, your worth isn't measured by another person's expectations. Sometimes, the greatest success comes from having the courage to forge your own path. Later that night, as we celebrated at a restaurant in downtown Manhattan, Matthew raised his glass. To Eliza, he said, who taught us all what real courage looks like. Valerie joined the toast. To the sister I always admired but never properly told. My mother was the last to speak, her voice soft but unwavering. To my daughter, who I've always been proud of, and who helped me find my own voice. As we clinked glasses, I realized that I'd finally received the validation I'd spent a lifetime seeking, not from my father, but from the people who truly mattered. And more importantly, I'd found it within myself. The celebration continued late into the evening. Friends and colleagues stopped by our table to offer congratulations. My editor Sophia hugged me tightly, whispering, "I told you readers need hope. Look around you, you're giving it to them." She was right. Throughout the evening, people had approached me to share their stories, of standing up to powerful men who abused their positions, of finding the courage to speak truth even when it cost them personally, of rebuilding their lives after betrayal. A woman in her 60s pressed a trembling hand to mine. "My husband controlled our finances for 40 years, she confided. "After reading your book, I asked to see our accounts for the first time. He gambled away most of our retirement. Your story gave me the strength to leave him." A young man, barely out of college, told me how my book had helped him recognize the emotional manipulation his boss was using to exploit junior employees. "I reported him to HR," he said proudly. 3 other associates came forward after I did. These stories humbled me. What had begun as a personal journey of investigation and revelation had rippled outward, touching lives I would never have imagined reaching. Around midnight, as the celebration was winding down, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something prompted me to look. "Saw your win on the news. Proud of you, kid. Your grandfather would have been too." Diane Reynolds, my father's former assistant, whose evidence had been crucial to the case. I hadn't heard from her since she testified at his trial. I quickly texted back, "None of this would have happened without your courage. Thank you." Her response came moments later, "We both did what needed doing. Sleep well, Eliza." Outside the restaurant, snow had begun to fall, dusting the Manhattan streets with white. Jacob hailed a cab for my mother, who was staying at a hotel nearby. As she prepared to leave, she took my hands in hers. "I meant what I said in the toast," she told me, her eyes clear and direct in a way they rarely had been during my childhood. "I've always been proud of you. I just didn't have the courage to say it when it mattered most." "You're saying it now," I replied, squeezing her hands. "That matters too." She nodded, then surprised me by pulling me into a fierce hug. "Your father was wrong about you," she whispered. "He was wrong about so many things." As her cab pulled away, Valerie linked her arm through mine. "Look at us," she said with a small laugh. "The Wheeler women, standing on their own." Matthew joined us, draping his coat around my shoulders against the cold. "Not alone," he corrected. "Standing together." We walked a few blocks together through the falling snow before separating to our respective homes, Valerie to her apartment in Tribeca, Matthew to his place in Soho, and me to the Brooklyn brownstone I'd recently purchased with my book advance. The advance had been substantial, enough to buy a modest home and still have savings left over. I donated a portion to a fund for my father's victims, particularly those who'd been unable to recover their full losses through the legal proceedings. It felt important to acknowledge that while my story had ultimately led to success, many others were still struggling with the aftermath of my father's crimes. Alone in my new home, I kicked off my heels and padded through the quiet rooms. Unlike the mansion I'd grown up in, with its cavernous formal spaces designed more for impressing guests than comfortable living, my brownstone felt like a true sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the furniture chosen for comfort rather than status, the artwork personal and meaningful rather than selected to demonstrate wealth or taste. On my desk sat a framed photo from earlier that year, a surprise birthday picnic my siblings and mother had organized in Central Park. In it, we were all laughing, our heads close together, a tangle of arms and genuine smiles. It was perhaps the first family photo I had where everyone looked truly happy, not posed or performative. Beside it was the fountain pen my grandmother had given me at graduation, which I'd finally taken out of its box. I'd used it to sign my book contract, and later, to sign copies at my first reading. A small act of reclamation that felt significant. I made myself a cup of tea and curled up by the window, watching the snow transform the city. My mind drifted to my father, sitting in his prison cell. I wondered if he'd heard about the award, if he understood yet the magnitude of what he'd lost, not just his freedom and reputation, but the love and respect of his family. I wondered if he ever thought about the alternate path his life might have taken if he'd chosen honesty over deception, genuine connection over control, love over pride. I hoped, for his sake, that he did. But his journey was no longer my burden to carry. The failure sitting at the Thanksgiving table had never been me. It had been the man at the head of it, too blinded by greed and ego to see the strength of the daughter he dismissed for so long. I was Eliza Wheeler, whistleblower, author, daughter, sister, friend. And I was nobody's failure.